Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just bear with me one moment while I just log back into my Chromebook, because it's logged me out, and I can't speak until I can see my script. There we go, great. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for having me along today. It's just been really lovely to be here, lovely to chat to so many of you. Thanks for the encouragement. Thanks for giving me a chance to come and speak on Ruth as well. This book is my absolute favourite, and it's just been such a joy to share it with you today. I hope that it's been a blessing to you. I hope that it will keep being a blessing as we spend time finishing it this afternoon. We're going to start, though, with a little recap of where we were this morning, in case we've forgotten. The story began with tragedy and loss, but the sovereignty of God remained throughout. Naomi lost her family, but God remained constant. We saw him provide for Naomi through the kindness and the hard work of Ruth. We saw God provide for Ruth and Naomi through the generosity of Boaz. But that provision that we've seen is only a temporary one. They're free to glean through the wheat harvest and then the barley harvest, a period of about 4 months. But once the harvest ends, what are they going to do? Will they have enough to keep going? Will they make it through? What are they going to do when they're still on their own? Naomi's goal from the beginning was to find rest for Ruth, but that hasn't been found yet. It's time for action, but before we get going, we need to take a little detour and have a little tutorial in a fairly obscure bit of Old Testament law. It's weird, but it's also really important if we want to understand what's going on in the rest of the story. So please bear with me. It's actually 2 laws. I know that's not the dream on a Saturday afternoon, but concentrate. It's going to be great. The first one, law number 1, is the law of levirate marriage. This is all about providing an heir. So this system that existed all over many ancient cultures, still exists in some cultures today, was all about maintaining lines of inheritance, as well as providing for vulnerable women. So if a man and a woman married, but the husband died before any sons were conceived, then it created 2 problems. Firstly, there's no heir, and so no way of carrying on the family line. And secondly, there's no home or living or protection for the widow. So in levirate marriage, when that man dies, his wife marries his brother or another close male relative. And if they have a son, that son is considered the dead man's heir, rather than the son of the biological father. This kept the line going. It meant there was a son to inherit. And it also meant that the woman was going to be cared for and know that her future was secure. So that's law number 1. Law number 2 is the law of the kinsman redeemer, which we have translated in the NIV as the guardian redeemer. This is something that's specific to Israel, and it's mostly related to keeping land in the family. When God's people came into the land at the beginning of Joshua, everything is divided up and portioned out to each tribe and each family. The land didn't belong to you, it was God's land, and it was given to you to look after and to look after you. So you took care of the land, and then the land kept you fed. You could farm, you could eat, you could live. But because it wasn't really your land, you couldn't sell it. It was supposed to stay in your family, and so there were lots of systems in place to make sure that it did. Firstly, if someone found themselves in a bad financial situation, they could sell it to another family member. That person was known as the kinsman redeemer. They were the first port of call to keep the land from leaving the family. But they also could get called in for 2 other related issues. If you'd been so desperate that you needed to sell your land to somebody who wasn't in the family, then you were able to do that. You were able to sell it, and then somebody from the kinsman redeemer would turn up and they would buy it back from that stranger that you'd sold it to. They would redeem it, and they would restore it to its rightful place. And if you were really desperate about Oh, sorry. My computer's doing something crazy. It stopped. Great, sorry. If you were really desperate and you'd had to sell not just your land, but also yourself, you'd had to become a slave in order to survive, well, then your kinsman redeemer would come and they would rescue you, they would pay your debts, they would set you free, and they would bring you home. That's the basis, and that's the kind of idea behind this law. And these laws connect, and for the purposes of this story, they're basically being strung together like a package deal. It feels really niche, but it's really important for the plot. So thank you so much for paying attention, bearing with me. Let's go back to the story. Boaz is a close family member. He's related to Naomi's late husband. I'm so sorry. This is just... My laptop's talking to me, and I don't know why. I think it stopped. Okay, sorry. Boaz is a close family member. He's related to Naomi's late husband, and as such, he can step into both roles, okay? He can provide an heir, so he can take the levirate marriage place on, and he can also redeem the land. But despite 4 months of harvest, he hasn't said anything or made any moves. And so Naomi decides that she is going to find rest for Ruth. If she's going to do that, then they're going to need to take matters into their own hands. So we begin with Ruth's boldness in the story. The first thing that happens is that Naomi decides that they really need to get a bit more actively involved in this situation. And since what they want at the end of the day is a marriage proposal, she encourages Ruth to act as if that's going to happen. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are Instagram or TikTok fans. If you are, you may be familiar with this year's kind of real phenomenon. Is he proposing or? Okay, let me explain. Basically, women who think that their boyfriend is about to propose make a video of the day with the series of questions. Is he proposing, or has he just planned a secret romantic date? Is he proposing, or has he just sent me off to get a manicure? Is he proposing, or has he just told me to wear my nicest outfit? Is he proposing, or has he just booked a meal at our favourite restaurant with a perfect view of the sun setting over the ocean, etc.? Obviously, the answer is always he is proposing, because we would not be seeing the video if he had not. But it does say a lot for the current generation of proposing men. They seem to know how much their future wife wants to have lovely photos of that special day, and so they set it up that way. I have never been proposed to, but I have seen a lot of post-proposal pictures from friends and family, and the biggest clue that a woman knew that it was coming is always the state of her nails in the picture. If she has a fresh manicure, it is a pretty good sign she knew what was coming. Ruth and Naomi, however, do not have that problem. They don't need to guess because they've taken matters into their own hands. And Ruth, therefore, gets dressed up and ready for a proposal and a wedding in the hopes that Boaz will agree. It sounds charming, but we've got to bear in mind the real risk that Ruth is going to here. I mentioned this morning that the historical setting for the book of Ruth is during the time of the Judges. And if you've read that book, then you will know that life for women has become increasingly and terrifyingly dangerous. The kind of story of the Judges is one that gets worse and worse for women. Increasingly throughout the story, more violence, more fear. It's scary enough for Ruth to go out into the fields alone in chapter 2, but to do what she is doing now is 100 times worse. She has gone out alone at night to an all-male gathering where the men have spent the day working and the evening drinking. I think she knows... Okay, sorry. I'm going to just adjust this slightly because it's just... This is really annoying. I'm so sorry. It's just one of these things where... Would you be able to pass me my phone? I'm going to speak from my phone like a real millennial. Because this is just going to annoy me otherwise. It keeps talking to me. I think it keeps trying to read my talk to me, which you can't hear, but I can. and it's very stressful. So hold on, bear with. Where was I up to? Ruth was getting bold and doing a dangerous thing. Okay, I'm here. Right. So it's a dangerous time. She was doing a dangerous thing by going to the field. Now she's going out at night to an all-male gathering where the men have spent the day working and the evening drinking. And I think she knows enough about Boaz to trust him, not to do anything terrible. But what about the other men who are there? What about them? Did you see what Naomi's instructions were to her? Check where he's lying and then go find him in the dark. Can you imagine? What if she forgets where he is? What if she goes and lies down next to the wrong man? Beyond the physical harm, what about her reputation? She's already got a lot to deal with. This is a Moabite woman in Israel. But what if one of the neighbours sees her making her way down to the threshing floor and gets the wrong idea? This moment is full of the utmost tension and risk. And yet Naomi has instructed her, just lie down at his feet. And when he sees you, he's going to tell you what to do. So all Ruth has to do is her bit, and then Boaz is going to take over, right? No. Because Boaz's immediate reaction on waking and finding a woman by his feet is not a list of instructions, but the quite reasonable question, who are you? It's dark. He's had a couple of drinks, and he's just woken up, and so he does not recognize her, and he just wants to know what's going on. And this is one of my favorite moments of the story, because Ruth doesn't panic. She doesn't freeze. She just calmly and boldly takes control of the situation. She hasn't just been blindly following her mother-in-law's instructions. She knows what the plan is, and now she needs to get involved. Look with me at verse 9, because this is really important, and there's something especially important in this that we might miss in our translation. We've been reading from the NIV, which I absolutely love, but this is one moment where the English translation gives us a bit of trouble. Ruth asks him to spread the corner of his garment over her. And whilst that is our meaning of what's happened here, what she asks him to do, the literal translation adds something quite important. What she literally asks him to do is spread your wings over me. And if we remember Boaz's words to her back in chapter 2, then we're going to realize what a significant statement that is. He praised her for taking refuge and shelter under the wings of the God of Israel. She now asks Boaz to give her refuge and shelter under his wings, because Boaz is her kinsman redeemer. It is a bold proposal to make, but it's the perfect one for Ruth to make to Boaz because of the kind of man that he is. Let's pay some attention to Boaz now. Despite his initial confusion, happily, he really quickly works out what's going on. And as I said, this is the perfect way to propose marriage to him. This is not a romance story in the classical sense. And we see that by his response. To start with, he calls her daughter, and then he praises her kindness for not running after younger men. It's not the classic response to a marriage proposal. This is enough of a confirmation to us that there's a decent age gap between Ruth and Boaz. She's young, but she's not a baby. She's been married for 10 years already, so she's probably in her mid to late 20s. And so for Boaz to call her daughter implies that he is a good bit older than her. For a man in this time and place, this also means that he's likely already married. And this gives us a clue as to why he might not have made a move already. He has assumed that Ruth wouldn't be interested. She could have married someone closer to her age, but he recognizes that instead of just wanting to marry someone for her own security and comfort, her own rest, she is looking to do more. She's looking to take care of her new family, and she's looking to honor her late husband's memory, to ensure that he has an heir, so that Naomi can have rest, the land can be cared for, and their memory live on. That's why Boaz praises her for her actions, their kindness to her family, but they're also a kindness to Boaz, because it's giving him yet another chance to obey the law. I talked this morning about Boaz's approach to the law. Rather than seeing it as a burden, he sees it as a gift. He sees it as a foundation to build on. He always goes above and beyond, and is delighted to do so because it's part of the way that he loves and worships God. And here, Ruth is giving him another opportunity to do that. She could have gone after another man. She could have given him the chance, could have given them the chance to obey the law, but instead she's offered the opportunity to Boaz, and he is thrilled to do so. So far, so great, but it wouldn't be a good story without one more twist. And this one comes in the form of another relative, unnamed and unmentioned before now. There is another man in the town who is a closer relative, and so therefore has a bigger claim. There's a potential big spanner in the works, but Boaz is committed to the plan and is committed to making sure that Ruth is taken care of whatever happens. So he reassures her, sends her home with a gift to encourage her, and just notice what Naomi says when she hears the update. Final verse of chapter 3. Then Naomi says, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." In other words, Boaz won't rest until rest for Ruth has been sorted out. We've seen Ruth put herself at risk, but now it's Boaz's turn. And this time the risk is slightly less obvious and requires us to remember the little lesson and those two laws from earlier. We've discovered that there is another man who has a closer connection, and therefore a greater claim. And specifically, the greater claim is to do with the land rather than Ruth, because although we have met Ruth and we know what a great cat she is, as far as the rest of society is concerned, the land is what's the big bonus here, okay? Now, Naomi's husband had a plot of land. Naomi can't work it, but she can sell it. But as I said, land in Israel being what it is, she wants and she needs to sell it to someone in the family. It is a great deal. She'll have money to live off, and the man who buys it will gain extra land and so grow richer as he works it. However, as Boaz points out to the fella in question, this land comes in a package deal with Ruth. And that changes things, because if the man marries Ruth and she then has a son, that son won't be that man's son. He will be her late husband's heir. And the land that he paid for will belong to that child. He'll have spent all of that money, but he won't be able to pass the land on to his son, to his heir. He doesn't want to risk his inheritance. He doesn't want to risk having a son who doesn't count as his. And since he doesn't love the law like Boaz does, he doesn't see any benefit or any joy in obeying it. Boaz's approach is quite different. His love for the Lord and his love for the law means that he considers the risk entirely worthwhile. To lose the money, to give away the land, and to provide a son to be another man's heir is all an opportunity to serve God, and he is delighted to do so. Do you ever think about God's law in the same way? When realizing that we need to make sacrifices or do risky things or just obey God, do we see that as a joy or a burden? I find this a really big challenge. I want to love the law like Boaz did. I want to love the law like Boaz did. Both Ruth and Boaz make a sacrifice. Both of them put themselves at risk for others, and God honors their boldness. He honors their love, their kindness, and their obedience. He honors them by providing the longed-for rest for Naomi and Ruth. No more worry, no more fear, about the gleaned grain running out, or the danger of being women alone and defenseless. They have a home. They have a family. They have wings to shelter under. They have rest. He honors them by causing both Boaz and Ruth to be praised at the city gates. Boaz, who was willing to have his name be forgotten and provide a son for the line of Elimelech, ends up being remembered much more than he could ever have imagined. Not just appearing in a genealogy, but this story, honored by God for his obedience and remembered for his willingness to be forgotten. Can you imagine trying to explain to Boaz in, 1200 BC? That's right, isn't it? Yeah. Like 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before Jesus, over 3,000 years ago, one day there's going to be a group of women sitting in a conference centre in Bristol who are going to be hearing all about your story. He'd have been like, what? Why? And yet that is part of how God has honoured him in remembering him and having his story be remembered. He was willing to be forgotten, and yet he is remembered. And ironically, the man who was unwilling to risk being forgotten isn't even named. In his desire to preserve his inheritance, he has lost it. Ruth, who had arrived as a foreign widow, is now married into the people of God and at rest in the home of a kind and godly man. Ruth had also arrived as a woman who had remained childless through 10 years of her first marriage. And yet, wonderfully at this point, we're told that God opened her womb and she gives birth to a son. And again, it's worth noticing how meaningful that is. As we've seen already, the reality of being a woman was very hard. You needed a man to protect and provide and defend you, your father, your husband, but best of all, your son. A son was a great blessing from God. He could carry on your family line, of course, but for a woman, for a mother, it meant that your future was secure and your rest was guaranteed. We see something of the joy of that in the words that the women of the city speak to Naomi, praising God for the gift of Ruth, your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better than 7 sons. To be blessed with 7 sons was to be blessed beyond all measure, and for Ruth, the Moabite, the childless widow, to be lauded as more than 7 sons is the highest possible compliment that could ever be paid. And finally, God honors Naomi by providing restoration, a grandson in place of her sons, a daughter-in-law in place of her sons, fullness instead of emptiness, joy instead of bitterness, rest instead of striving. We get our final happy ending. The longed-for rest has been achieved, and then there's a little afterward, a genealogy to help explain why this story has been retold and remembered and written down. Because this baby son, Obed, grows up and has a son called Jesse. And that baby son, Jesse, grows up and has a son called David. And that baby son, David, grows up to be the king of Israel. That's why this super ordinary story has been remembered and retold. Because whilst it might have felt very ordinary and normal to Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, it turns out to be the means by which King David comes to be. And of course, 1,000 years later, and many generations of genealogy on, it turns out to be the means by which King Jesus is born. Ruth's many times great-grandson is the Son of God. And as we look closely at the story, we see the ways that Boaz functions as what we would call a type of Christ, a kind of signpost in the Old Testament that points us ahead to what is coming. Think about the many ways that Boaz resembles his descendant and his Lord. Boaz puts his reputation and wealth at risk to give Ruth and Naomi rest. He willingly chooses his name to be forgotten in order to give an heir to a dead man. Jesus faces ridicule, rejection, violence, and death to give us rest. He willingly goes to the cross and dies in order to give life to us. Boaz loves the law of the Lord and delights to obey God and serve others. Jesus is the only one who keeps the law perfectly and completely. And as he does so, he keeps it not only for himself, but for us too. Where we fail to love and obey the law, we know that Jesus has already done it for us. Boaz is a kind and lovely bridegroom, a husband who marries a foreign wife, gives her a family, a home, and a future. Jesus is the perfect bridegroom, and when we see him face to face, it will be our wedding day, dressed in the finest clothes that he has bought for us, given a new family, a new home, and an eternity of rest with him. Boaz works hard so that he can give Ruth and Naomi rest. Jesus has finished his work, completed the task he had set before him, and is right now sitting down at the right hand of the throne of God. Rest has been fought for and won. It is certain and guaranteed. Boaz spreads his wings over Ruth to give her shelter, refuge, protection, and rest. Jesus offers us shelter under his wings now, and the promise of rest at a wedding feast still to come. Sisters, we have seen the kindness of God in Boaz, but Jesus is so much kinder, so much better, so much more generous, and so much lovelier than we could ever imagine. He offers you rest now and rest forever. And the story of Ruth enables us to see a little glimpse of that reality through the lives of these ordinary people, and a little taste of what rest with Jesus can and should be. As we finish then, let's just consider how we can learn from the story, how we can be shaped by their example, and how we can find rest in Jesus while we wait for his return. Verse 1, be bold like Ruth. The Christian faith requires us to be brave sometimes, to do risky things, scary things, to follow in the footsteps of our Saviour, to pick up our cross and follow him. The life of a Christian is one of sacrifice, not to earn our salvation. Jesus has already won that for us. Not to achieve our rest. Jesus has already worked to make that happen, but as an act of worship and gratitude to God who has made us and loves us and ordains our every step. Secondly, let's be obedient like Boaz. Again, I think we tend to think of the law of God as a burden rather than as a blessing. And yet I hope that as we've met Boaz today, we've been able to glimpse some of his joy and long to have more of that for ourselves. I'd love to say that my delight is in the law of the Lord. I'd love to describe God's law as sweeter than honey and more precious than gold. And I would love to recognize opportunities to obey God's law as a gift. If you feel the same way, why not pray that God would grow that desire in you? Why not pray that he would help you recognize those mitzvahs and find joy in obedience? And thirdly, let's take shelter under the wings of Jesus and wait expectantly and joyfully for the wedding feast and final perfect rest. Dear sisters, that day is certain, that day is promised, that day is coming soon, and that day is going to exceed all of our expectations. In moments of tiredness now, fix your heart on Jesus and look forward to the rest to come. It is going to be glorious beyond all measure. What a kind God we have. What a kind Saviour we have. What a kind Redeemer we have. Let's praise him, worship him, and be devoted to him. We're going to have a moment now to reflect, and I think there may be some questions that come up on the screen, and then we're going to sing. So let's have a moment now just to reflect and consider what we've learned.